a whisper in the rain, a secret no one was meant to hear. Welcome to Mystery Parlor. I am your host, Axon. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments make every story come alive. Let's dive in. On certain evenings, the city seemed to be breathing through the rain. The drops slid down the glass in slow vertical threads, and the lamps along the Quai des Orfèvres wore pale halos, like old men with untrimmed beards considering whether to speak. Maigret stood at his window with a pipe in his mouth, tamped without lighting, the bowl pressed against the half-moon of his palm. The Seine was a voice more than a river, a constant murmur under the patter on the parapet. He had not meant to linger at the office. There had been no urgent calls, no dossier with red pencil underlining, only a memo left crooked on his blotter by a clerk who scribbled and never aligned anything. On the memo, in a hand he recognized and could not immediately place, were the words, "In case he asks," followed by nothing. It was not important, not even unusual, but it felt like the kind of nothing that has the shape of something. Down the corridor, a typewriter clacked and then stopped. It was a Sunday night. Those who wrote on Sunday nights did so out of habit rather than necessity, and habits were often more revealing than emergencies. He lit the pipe. The first draw was bitter, then softened, becoming the taste of what he was accustomed to. He took his overcoat from the peg in the corner, shrugged into it with a small snort at the stiffness of one sleeve. The tailor had promised to fix that, but did not leave yet. The rain made Paris honest, he used to tell Madame Maigret. It made everything more itself. Lovers hurried like people late for a train. Drunks were all drunks, not loud men with plans. The windows of pensions and cafes grew warm under their own breath. He had meant to go home an hour ago, and that would have been agreeable too. The apartment on Boulevard Richelieu, the smell of onions sautéed slowly, the small sound of crockery being set aside in the draining rack. On Sundays, she did not fuss. She would put out a plate for him and lift an eyebrow as if to ask a question he would or would not answer. He would say something about a sergeant who had attempted to calculate overtime against his pension. They would say little, and the little would mean enough. He took the hat from the peg and then set it back again. The rain was neither hard nor light. It was the sort that made a hat brim sag, a coat collar useless. He turned from the window and walked the corridor, a slow prowl he had taken so many nights it had its own map in his feet. At the switchboard, the young woman on duty had a magazine tucked under the console and braced it open with a roll of adhesive labels. "Nothing?" he asked. He was not really asking. "Nothing, Chief." She had an untidy crown of hair and a polite voice. The hospital at Necker called to confirm receipt of the report on the man from yesterday. Inspector Torrance signed off. He nodded. The first puff from the pipe had gone, and he did not draw again. It was enough to hold it at the corner of his mouth. In the glass part of the door leading out to the staircase, someone had left a wet umbrella leaning, disobedient to any umbrella stand. A black one with a hook handle. He pressed his thumb into the leather of the handle and felt the dent of other thumbs. It belonged to no one in particular, and to everyone who worked here. "Go home," he told the switchboard girl. "I'm on until 11. He could have said he would take the calls, and she could sleep on the bench under her coat. He didn't. The routine belonged to her the way the window belonged to him, and one did not confiscate a person's small allegiances. Outside the main door of the Prefecture, the rain had become a veil, stitched fine. He went down the steps slowly, feeling the weight of himself in his knees. He walked without choosing toward the Pont Saint-Michel, the traffic standing obediently under its own steam in the wet, the taxis with their dim flags lowered. A cafe offered a rectangle of light like a picture hung on the wall of night. He went in. It was the sort of place where the bar had dents, where generations of elbows had taught it to yield. On the zinc counter, a few saucers held their coffee cups like eggs in spoons. A man in a cap read a paper from the back to the front. The patron glanced up, recognized him, not for who he was, but for what he was, and gave him a nod that said, "We don't make a thing of it here." "Un blanc," he said, and then, after a moment, "Non, une bière." He took a chair near the window. The glass was fogged in the corners. At the outer edge of his vision, a woman stood under the cafe's awning, half-sheltered, with her head bent at the public telephone fixed to the wall. It was one of the old ones, the handset heavy, the cord reluctant. Her coat, a cheap black gabardine gone shiny at the elbows, clung to her like a tired cat. She spoke into the mouthpiece with a posture more than a voice. He could see her lips move, but not the words. He did not look at her directly. He watched the beads of rain gather on the awning's edge, swell fat, then drop in a regular, defeated rhythm. The woman lifted a hand, small bones in the wrist, and pressed it to the mouthpiece as if to tell her own breath to be quiet. The beer came. It was cold and ordinary, which was the way he liked beer to be when he had not earned it. When she put down the handset, she remained under the awning. She turned her head a little, not toward him, but toward the street, then toward the window's reflection of herself. She was in her late 30s, perhaps older the way some lives made faces older without the years. Her hair was pinned badly, and a strand clung to her cheek like a thread she hadn't found the end of. He had seen that look before. The look of someone who had just said something that had made a decision inside them, as if the words had arranged the furniture in a room, and now the room would be lived in differently. She left. He watched her walk to the corner. She did not look back. People who lied often looked back to see if the lie walked with them. People who had told the truth rarely did. He drank the beer and thought about the phone. He imagined, without wanting to, the slow turning of the dial, the pause at the metal stop, the wheel returning with its small secretive clicks. The sound was like counting, but without numbers. He went home. When he let himself into the apartment, it smelled faintly of simmered leeks and something buttery that had cooled into a film. Madame Maigret was not in the kitchen. She sat in the sitting room with a book folded face down on her lap like a meek bird. The radio was tuned to a station that played waltzes too slow to be danced to. "You ate," she said. "I had a beer. I could warm the soup." "No, leave it." He hung his coat on the chair back and went to the window here too. At home, the rain spoke differently. It was more domestic, tapping on the balcony rail as if to ask to come in to dry itself by the stove. She watched him, not anxiously, but as she had watched him every evening for 30 years, marking the invisible weather of his face. "Someone telephoned," she said. "A woman." He turned slightly. "For me?" "She didn't ask for you. She didn't say. She asked if this was the house of the inspector who wears a brown hat. I told her perhaps he has 3 hats. She laughed a little, or maybe it was not a laugh. She said she would call again. "What time?" "Half an hour ago." He glanced at the clock. He could see her adding details only when they had become solid in her mind. She did not give away speculation as a gift. "Did she tell you her name?" "She didn't, but she whispered. People who whisper on the telephone are silly in the cinema." This was not silly. He did not say that he had seen a woman speaking into a telephone, whispering with her hand at her mouth, under a cafe awning near the bridge. He did not say it, because it did not need to be said yet for the thing to have weight. Telling is an act of spending. They sat with the radio low. He took off the hat and set it on the table. The book on her lap breathed open and closed when the pages released themselves and then settled again. He felt the sense of something simple and inaccessible, like a penny glimpsed at the bottom of a fountain. When he slept, which was later than he had planned, the rain had grown patient. He dreamed of a telephone that did not stop returning to the same number, even when he dialed others. In the morning, he woke to the smell of coffee and the ordinary dignity of a weekday. He did not speak of the woman when he knotted his tie. He did not say he would go by the cafe. He kissed his wife's hair, which was warm from the iron, and took his brown hat, which had a stain on the ribbon he had never managed to remove. At the Préfecture, the corridor had its Monday faces, the men who carried files like babies they had not yet decided whether to love. The switchboard girl rubbed her eyes as if the ends of her fingers had been dipped in chalk. "Morning," he said. She straightened. "Morning, Chief." He was almost at his office when she called after him. "Chief." He turned. "There was a call," she said, in a tone that apologized for existing. "Just before you came in. A woman. She asked if an inspector with a brown hat was in." He stood, large but not imposing, the way a cupboard stands in a kitchen and makes the room ordinary by its existence. He took the pipe from his pocket and looked at it as if it could be persuaded to have something to say. "What did she want?" "She didn't say." The girl touched the magazine under the console as if to hide the bright cover that suddenly embarrassed her. "She whispered. I wanted to ask her to repeat it. I didn't. She said only—" She hesitated, trying to capture the words as they had sounded, not as they ought to have sounded. She said, "He won't wake up on his own." Then she hung up. He nodded. He did not ask who he was. He did not ask for the number. People who whispered left no numbers. He went to his office and set the pipe on the blotter where the memo with "In case he asks" still lay, ridiculous and faintly accusing. He sat. He drew the chair closer with a sound like the rain had made on the balcony rail. He waited. The city breathed through the rain. Somewhere a woman had told the truth to no one in particular, and it had made a decision inside her. He didn't light the pipe. He rolled it between his fingers and listened to the hum that buildings make when they begin their day. The whisper had left its words behind like a damp handprint. He won't wake up on his own. It was not panic, not quite a warning, a description. He put on the brown hat and left the office without collecting a joint. A man who would not wake was not yet a crime. It was an address without a street. Outside, the rain had turned to a faint drizzle that felt almost like the air had perspired. He walked toward the Pont Saint-Michel, not because he expected to find the woman, but because his feet wanted to pass by the awning, to see the telephone there, the dumb round mouth of it waiting for a coin. The cafe had the stale cheerfulness of places that have survived both morning and night. Two men in blue overalls ate croissants as if they were wages. The patron wiped the counter with the authority of someone who trusts neither time nor sugar. He took his place by the window without ordering. "You came back," she said finally, in a voice that had been kept dry in a cupboard. "I didn't leave properly." He glanced at the phone under the awning. "A woman used your telephone last night." "She did. You saw her." "It was not a question." "She didn't drink. It's not a charity here. I don't mind a call in bad weather, but one must show willing." He let the silence take up the space at the table. The patron's cloth found an invisible line of stickiness and pursued it into the corners. "She paid," she added, a little affronted. "A 10-centime coin, and then another when the first didn't go through. The line was poor. It often is when it rains. Water makes the city truthful and clumsy." "Did she give a name?" "She did not. Everyone thinks first names are masks and family names are swords." She poured him a coffee without asking. She spoke like a person who has learned not to be overheard. "Did she come alone?" "A woman alone is two things at once." The patron shrugged. "But yes. No man waited outside to fidget." He sipped. It was ordinary coffee, brave enough to call itself coffee. On the zinc he noticed a damp circle where a small gloved hand might have rested. The glove had left no mark but the wet had. He had a picture in his mind of a glove turned inside out in a hallway and not returned to itself afterward. "If she comes again," he said, "tell her the inspector in the brown hat drinks his coffee too quickly and can be made to wait." The patron nodded, as if this were a recipe she might try some day. He left a coin and went under the awning. He lifted the receiver of the public phone and listened to the sleepy ocean noise of the line. He dialed nothing. The tiny clicks counted their own returns. He replaced the handset gently, as if not to wake it. By the time he returned to the quay, the switchboard girl had new color in her cheeks, anger or embarrassment, the two paints used most at her age. She gestured awkwardly with the label's roll. "Someone from the 12th arrondissement telephoned," she said. "A concierge." She asked for the big inspector who doesn't rush. Did she say why? She said her lodger wouldn't wake up. The girl swallowed, aware of the echo. She said it was probably nothing, but the smell was not right. She didn't want the ambulance men yet, in case it was something else, and then the police would think she was making a fuss. "What address?" The girl pushed a slip of paper toward him as if it were delicate. "Rue de Lyon," a number that belonged to a building with shoes at its door more often than visitors. He took the paper, tucked it into his wallet, and felt again the shape of that first memo, in case he asks. Ridiculous still, but now less alone on the blotter of his thoughts. He did not summon a car. The tram made him a passenger with the city, and he preferred that when he hoped to arrive, not as an answer but as a question. The windows filmed over with the breath of the morning. He wrote a little arc with his thumb so he could see. The rain, undecided, kept to itself. Rue de Lyon wore its work clothes openly. Carts with their skeletal harnesses leaned like tired men against the curb. The building at the number the concierge had given had a door whose paint had been repainted too many times without removing the old. He entered into the smell of cabbage and dust warmed by bodies. The concierge, who had placed herself like a piece of furniture in a lodge that allowed her to be both seated and vigilant, regarded him with the weight of years in which she had watched men arrive to find the things they had not expected to find. "You are the one who doesn't rush," she said, relieved and disapproving together. "I didn't want the noisy ones." He nodded once. "Who won't wake?" "The bookkeeper on the 3rd floor back. He's not my favorite. He's polite and pays on time, but he cooks onions with vinegar. We all have to breathe it." "What name?" "Chabrier, not the composer. He laughs when one says it. He has a father in Chartres. He tells me the same story twice every month when he pays. Men who repeat their stories are not dangerous. They are lonely." He listened to the staircase the way one listens to a person describing their childhood. Each step had its complaint. On the 2nd landing, a bicycle waited without a front wheel. On the 3rd, a window with cracked putty admitted a light that made everything look as if it had been dusted with flour. He could smell it before he knocked, a sweetish edge under the onion that was now only a memory. He tried the door handle. It gave. He did not like that, but a man who cooked onions with vinegar and told the same story twice might not be careful. He entered without ceremony. The room was small, arranged in the economy of someone who has no dependents except his habits. On the table, a plate with the dried rim of a sauce, a glass with the faint crescent of a lip where someone had drunk thinking of something else, an alarm clock with its hands obedient, 6:10, though it was now nearly 10. The bed held a man on his side, knees drawn a little, not the posture of a sleeper. Maigret took 2 steps and stood still. The sweet smell was the kind that liked to lodge in the back of the mouth. The window was shut, the curtain tugged as if someone had taken it between 2 fingers and then changed their mind. On the armchair, a jacket had been folded carefully, pockets heavy in a way that made the fabric slouch. On the floor, near the foot of the bed, a slipper that had not been kicked off but had not been put on. It was placed almost politely. He touched the shoulder through the thin blanket. The flesh underneath was the wrong temperature before one allows the word cold. He lifted the corner of the blanket just enough to see the face. Chabrier had the look of a man who has kept his mouth shut about a small thing for a long time and has been released from the effort. No struggle, no theater. He turned his head slightly, noticing the ashtray. One cigarette stub crushed in an even spiral, another broken and then reconsidered, a third that had burned to its end without being smoked. On the table beside, the second cup. a ring of coffee dark and light together, as if someone had sipped and then added milk. A guest. The second cup had been set down more gently than the first. He opened the window. The room inhaled like a chest allowed finally to move. The rain came in without being insolent. In the tiny kitchen corner, the tap had a drip that had been tied with a thread and then given up. He turned it once. The drip stopped. He returned to the bed and looked again without dwelling. Small details do not present themselves when stared at. Back on the landing, the concierge waited with her hands in her apron, palms outward as if to show she had not taken anything. "He's dead," he said, the way one might remark that a train has already left and there is no point in running. "I thought so," she said, proud of her nose and embarrassed by her pride. "He had a visitor last evening. That is not common. I heard steps that were careful, which is worse than loud ones. A woman, light feet and the sort of heel that wants to sound expensive." "What time?" "A little after 7. She did not stay long enough to make the air different in the corridor. She left without the ordinary conversation. You know, the bonsoir that people use like an umbrella. She did not have that." "Did she speak to you?" "She did not want to be seen speaking, but I saw her. A coat that had once been better, a hat pulled low. She had the posture of a woman who thinks the staircase will judge her." He nodded. "And this morning?" "This morning he did not go down. He gets his milk downstairs at 8 and frowns at the newspaper headlines as if they were my fault." She hesitated, then added with a small blush, "I know his footsteps. We learn people by the noises they make without meaning to." He went back into the room and the telephone for the doctor and the necessary formalities, speaking without urgency, because the dead do not require haste. He gave his name only at the end, as if to pay after eating. When he hung up, he looked again at the second cup. The saucer had a chip that did not match the others in the cupboard. On the way out, he paused at the window on the landing. Across the courtyard, another window held a woman pruning a dead leaf from a geranium with the seriousness of a surgeon. He filed away her existence the way one keeps a coin for the right machine. "Send no one up," he told the concierge. "Not yet." She nodded, satisfied to have her authority reconfirmed by a larger one. Back on the street, he bought a packet of matches he did not need and stood under a shop awning, protecting a pipe he still did not light. The drizzle thickened and then thinned like a conversation that chooses its words. He felt very distinctly that the woman who had whispered on the telephone and the woman who had gone up the staircase were not necessarily two women. He was not yet ready to decide. He returned to the quay not to file a report, but to sit in his chair and let the room earn his attention. The memo still lay where it had, in case he asks. The scrawl impudent. He thought of the second cup, the polite slipper, the alarm clock stuck at a time that did not belong to any emergency. He thought of the sentence that had come through the wire to the switchboard. He won't wake up on his own. He waited again, and Paris breathed, and somewhere a woman debated the weight of a hat in her hands. The hours that followed moved like a watch with a hesitant spring. The rain had eased to a thin mist that clung to the edges of windows and made the gas lamps appear to float in their own halos. Maigret sat in his office, not writing, only drawing small circles on the blotter with the stem of his unlit pipe. Every so often, he'd look up at the memo still resting there, the one with the words, "in case he asks." It had stopped seeming ridiculous. It now felt almost expectant. He didn't yet write his report on Chabrier. The doctor had confirmed what Maigret already knew. The man had died sometime between 8 and 9 the previous evening, perhaps from a sedative, perhaps not. The bottle on the bedside table was labeled Veronal, with the neat signature of a local chemist, but it was not full enough and not empty enough to be reassuring. Maigret had seen suicides before. They left a certain order behind them. This room had only a kind of tidiness born of routine. Suicide had a gesture. This death had none. At 11:30, he went back out. The drizzle made the pavement smell of iron and bread. He didn't take the car again. He preferred to walk toward Rue de Lyon, to see who lived, who opened doors, who carried milk. Paris was most honest when people thought the police had gone. The concierge saw him through the glass door before he knocked. She came out, wiping her hands on her apron, though they were already clean. "They took him away," she said. "The little cart. Not noisy, not like when it's a murder. He looked tidy." "Tidy, yes," Maigret said. "Did anyone come after I left?" "No one. But I thought I saw her again this morning at the corner near the bakery. The same walk. A small woman. She stopped as if to look at the price of apples, but she wasn't looking." He nodded. "If she comes again, say nothing. Just watch." "I always do." He climbed the stairs again, slower this time. The door of Chabrier's room was sealed with paper, but seals could be opened and resealed with care. He entered quietly, as if the walls might remember footsteps. The light had changed. It fell through the grimy window in a weak yellow beam that stopped short of the bed. He looked at the small things. The thread he had seen tied around the tap, the saucer with its chipped edge, the half-empty box of matches on the table. He turned the box over. Inside were 2 matches and a folded scrap of paper that had been used to wedge them. He unfolded it carefully. It was a torn piece from a letter, no address, no signature. Only one line, written in a hurried, slanted hand. "It isn't true what they said about me." He slipped it into his pocket and stood for a while, listening to the quiet. The neighbors on either side were still asleep or pretending to be. The building had that dull hum of places where nothing urgent ever happened, until it did. Downstairs again, he spoke to the concierge one last time. "When was the rent due?" "Yesterday morning." He paid, as always. 300 francs, and he asked if I ever felt that people remembered the wrong things. I told him I tried not to let them. Maigret smiled faintly. "And after that, nothing unusual?" She hesitated, picking at the edge of her apron. "He received a letter that afternoon. I saw the postman hand it to him. Small, cream-colored envelope. He looked at it for a long while before he opened it. He tore it in 2 when he went upstairs, but later, when I emptied the bin from the hallway, the pieces were gone." He thanked her and left. Outside, the wind had changed direction. It came up the street from the river, bringing with it the smell of damp paper and coal. He turned his collar up and walked toward the quay without hurry, but with the sense that he was being followed, not by footsteps, but by the echo of a whisper that refused to fade. Back at headquarters, he found Inspector Janvier waiting near his office door with a notebook in hand. Janvier was neat, almost apologetically so, the kind of man who still polished his shoes on Sunday nights. "Doctor's report came through," he said, following Maigret inside. "Cause of death listed as veronal poisoning. Dosage uncertain, no sign of struggle." "No sign of intention either," Maigret murmured. "Did you check his bank account?" Janvier nodded. "Yes, nearly empty. 3 withdrawals in the past month, all in cash. No large purchases. He'd been selling his furniture bit by bit. Paid in cash, no receipts." Maigret grunted softly. A man who empties his room slowly isn't planning to leave it permanently. "Anything else?" Janvier asked. "His letterbox?" "Empty." He nodded again, absently. "Find out if anyone at his office noticed something. The address is in his papers." Janvier left, and Maigret leaned back in his chair, pipe unlit, eyes half closed. The whisper had said he won't wake up on his own. It was not the language of guilt. It was the language of care. Someone who had watched him die, perhaps not meaning to cause it, but unwilling or unable to help. There was affection in the phrasing. Regret, maybe. He thought again of the cafe, the woman under the awning, her small hand pressed to the mouthpiece. She had whispered then too, not out of fear, but of shame. He tried to remember the details, the coat with its shiny sleeves, the poor hat, the pin at her collar that had caught the light from the cafe lamp. It had been shaped like a tiny bird, wings folded. A decoration bought long ago when she had still wanted to be looked at. He rose suddenly, went to the coat stand, and took his hat. The cafe wasn't far, and the day was still grey enough to pass unnoticed. When he entered, the same patronne looked up, unsurprised. "She came again," she said before he could ask. "About an hour after you left yesterday." "What did she do?" "She stood under the awning as before. Didn't use the telephone this time. Just waited. Then she crossed the street and went toward the station." "Did she seem disturbed?" The patronne tilted her head. "Disturbed? No. Tired. She had the face of someone who's been trying to remember what she said and can't be sure of it." He thanked her. At the corner of the street, he stopped by the tobacconist to light his pipe finally. He looked toward the station entrance where the crowd flowed like a slow river under the iron arches. Women in dark coats, men with briefcases, all anonymous in the rain. But every few moments, a gesture, a walk, a turn of the head could make a stranger suddenly recognizable. At the edge of the platform, a woman was standing alone, half hidden by a pillar. She wore a black coat with the collar turned up and a hat pulled low. He couldn't see her face, but he recognized the slope of the shoulders, the posture that said she was waiting for a train that wasn't coming. He walked slowly, keeping her in sight. When he was near enough, he saw the small bird-shaped pin at her throat, catching the light from the overhead lamps. He stopped a few paces away. "You should be careful," he said quietly. "Trains are often late when it rains." She turned, startled but not frightened. Her eyes were grey, the kind that seemed to change color with mood. "You followed me?" "No, you returned." She looked at him for a moment, then away toward the tracks. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. People rarely do. He wasn't supposed to die." Her voice was barely above a breath. "He just wouldn't stop talking about the past, about what he hadn't done, about what people thought he'd done." Maigret said nothing. Silence, he knew, was the only language some confessions understood. "I only gave him something to make him sleep," she said at last. "He hadn't slept in days. He looked frayed. I thought if he could rest, he might stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "As if I were the reason for his life being so small." "And were you?" She gave a small, almost amused smile. "No, I just reminded him of it." He watched her eyes, the way they blinked too slowly, like someone choosing each word. "You called last night." "I wanted someone to find him. I didn't want him to be alone. I told the girl he wouldn't wake up. I thought maybe that would be enough." He nodded gently. "What's your name?" "Claire," she said after a pause long enough to sound like invention. "Claire Dufresne." He didn't contradict her. There was time enough to learn whether that was true. The train whistle blew from somewhere down the line, hollow and far. "You should come with me," he said. She looked at him again, the corners of her mouth trembling. Not resistance, not fear. Something else. "If I do, will you tell me what he said before he died?" "He didn't say anything," Maigret answered softly. "He was already asleep." She nodded once. And when she followed him from the station, her steps were light, almost soundless, like a whisper carried away by the rain. They walked in silence through the narrow streets that led back toward the river, the sound of their steps muffled by the damp. Claire kept her hands deep in the pockets of her coat, head lowered just enough that her hat brim caught the drizzle. Maigret let her set the pace. There was no need for handcuffs or urgency. She wasn't running. The ones who ran always had something to prove. She had only something to endure. When they reached the Quai des Orfèvres, she hesitated at the bottom of the steps, as if the building itself were a boundary she had known about all her life. Inside, the warmth was faint, the air heavy with the smell of tobacco and wet wool. Maigret led her not to an interrogation room, but to his office. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk, its leather worn and friendly. "You can take off your coat if you like," he said, removing his hat and setting it on the radiator. She shook her head. "I won't stay long." He sat heavily, folding his hands over the blotter. "That depends on what you tell me." Her eyes flicked to the window. The Seine, grey and swollen, pressed against its banks like something trying to remember its shape. "You'll think I'm lying," she said. "I usually do," he answered, not unkindly. "It helps me find the truth faster." For a long moment, the only sound was the clock on the wall marking time in patient ticks. She seemed to take strength from the rhythm. "I knew him," she began. "Years ago, before the war. He worked in an office near mine on Rue de Bercy. I was the secretary to a small insurance firm. He came in sometimes to deliver claims, always polite, always the same tie, the same umbrella. He wasn't the sort of man anyone noticed, but he noticed everything." "Did you love him?" She gave a small, bitter laugh. "No, not even then. But he cared for me in a way that made it hard to be cruel. He used to bring me newspapers from the day before, cut out with articles he thought I might like. Little things. He had no one. And recently? I saw him again by chance 2 months ago. I was coming out of a pharmacy in the 12th. He called my name as if no time had passed. I almost didn't recognize him. He looked worn. He said he'd moved nearby, that he was working part-time, keeping accounts for a small workshop. We had coffee. I shouldn't have gone." Her hands tightened around each other in her lap. Maigret waited, the way a doctor waits for the pulse beneath a patient's skin. He started writing. Letters, small notes. They came every few days. At first they were harmless. He remembered old things. Cafes, rain, the way I wore my hair. Then they changed. He began to write about what people thought of him, about how they whispered. He said there were lies that had ruined him. What kind of lies? That he had stolen money, years ago at his old firm. It wasn't true, he said. But no one believed him, and he had left quietly rather than fight. He thought someone, maybe even me, had spread it. He said I'd been the only one kind to him then, and that kindness had made others jealous. He started saying strange things, that I was being watched too, that we were both victims of the same injustice. Maigret's face didn't move, but his eyes sharpened slightly. "You went to see him?" She nodded. "Once. Yesterday evening." He had sent another letter, one I couldn't ignore. He said he'd found proof, something that would make everything clear. He begged me to come, just for a few minutes. Her voice faltered, and she pressed a hand to her throat as if to steady it. When I arrived, he seemed almost calm. The room smelled of onions, the way it always did. He showed me a piece of paper, a torn envelope with my name written in pencil. He said it had been returned from his old employer's office, that they were still keeping records of him, still trying to destroy what was left of his life. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. He said if I stayed, I'd understand. Then he poured 2 cups of coffee. She paused, eyes fixed on the blotter between them. I saw him open the small bottle of tablets. I asked what it was. He said he needed rest. I thought he meant to sleep, to stop his thoughts for a while. He asked if I'd drink with him. I told him no, but he poured 1 cup for himself and 1 for me, and while he talked, I sipped mine just to be polite. It was bitter. Maigret leaned forward slightly. "You saw him take the tablets?" "Yes. 3, maybe 4. He said he'd been taking them for weeks. He lay down after that, still talking, half dreaming. I thought he'd fall asleep, so I put my cup down and went to the window. I remember hearing a sound, a sigh maybe. When I turned back, his eyes were half open. I called his name, but he didn't answer. Why didn't you call a doctor? She gave a faint, hopeless smile. Because I didn't want them to think I'd killed him. And maybe, in some way, I had. He didn't answer right away. The sound of rain tapping against the glass filled the silence. "You left the letter you found?" "I didn't take anything, except—" She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. "This. He had it on the table when I arrived. He said it proved his innocence, but it's only an old receipt. I kept it without thinking. I didn't know what else to do." He took it carefully. The paper was creased and faintly damp. A receipt for a deposit, 300 francs, dated 5 years earlier, signed by a clerk from Chabrier's former office. Nothing unusual, but there was a faint pencil mark at the bottom, a circle drawn around the initials LD. Maigret looked at her. "Who's LD?" "I don't know," she said quickly. He mentioned the name once, Lemoine, perhaps, or Dubost, someone who had replaced him after the accusation. He tucked the paper into a file without comment. She watched his face, searching for something, understanding or maybe absolution. "What happens now?" she asked. "You'll stay here for a while. We'll have your statement written down properly. You'll rest." Her mouth twisted. "You make it sound like a kindness." "It is," he said simply. "Kindness is rarer here than guilt." She looked at him, uncertain, then gave a small nod. "If I could sleep, I would. I haven't since yesterday." He called for Janvier, who appeared quietly as if the air had warned him. "Take Mademoiselle Dufresne to one of the rooms downstairs. Make sure she's comfortable. No questions for now." When they left, Maigret remained seated for a long time, staring at the fogged window. He turned the receipt over in his hand. LD, a pair of initials that might mean everything or nothing. But something about the neat circle drawn around them bothered him. It was too deliberate, too self-conscious. Not the gesture of a desperate man. He took his coat again and stepped into the corridor. The building hummed faintly, footsteps on distant floors, the clicking of typewriters like rain made of metal. He moved slowly toward the archives, where the clerk sat behind a pile of folders and the smell of dust. "Find me the Chabrier file," Maigret said. 5 years back. Embezzlement inquiry, 12th arrondissement. I want to see who signed off the report." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "That's old business." "Old business has long shadows," Maigret said. When the folder arrived, the first page bore a signature written with thin, slanting care, Inspector L. Dubost. Maigret tapped the paper lightly with the stem of his pipe. "LD," he murmured. "He won't wake up on his own." The phrase came back to him again. Not a threat, not even a confession. A plea. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of it. Somewhere below, Claire Dufresne might have been sleeping at last, or pretending to. Either way, the quiet would not last. The paper felt dry between his fingers, brittle around the edges like something that had been touched by too many hands. Inspector L. Dubost. The name lingered on the page, heavy in its simplicity. Maigret sat with the file open before him on the long table of the archive room, the light overhead humming faintly. Dust lifted lazily in the lamplight whenever he turned a page, as if disturbed memories had taken physical form. The old investigation had been short, a missing sum from the accounts of a small shipping firm. Suspicion had fallen quickly, too quickly, on the bookkeeper, Georges Chabrier. There had been no proof of theft, only irregularities that made him an easy scapegoat. Dubost's notes were curt, impatient, written with the confidence of a man who wanted the matter closed rather than understood. The last line read, "Case concluded. Chabrier dismissed voluntarily. File to be archived." Maigret frowned. Voluntarily. The word had the smell of bureaucracy over it. No statement from Chabrier. No signed declaration. Just silence, stamped and approved. He rose, stretching his back, and took the file under his arm. The corridor outside was nearly empty, the day thinning into early evening. Through the rain-streaked windows, the river had turned black, its surface disturbed by ripples of reflected light. He stopped by the switchboard where the young operator had taken the mysterious call. She looked up quickly when she saw him. "Do you remember anything else about that woman's voice?" he asked. The girl hesitated, the memory pulling at her features. "Soft," she said finally. "Not frightened, but careful. Like someone talking in a church." She spoke slowly, as if she wasn't sure the words would come out right. She said... She stopped, uncertain. I thought I heard her say a name after that, just before the line went dead. "What name?" "Something like Louis, or maybe Luke." He nodded. "You did well." He left her with that, though the answer troubled him. Louis Dubos. It fit the initials. It fit too neatly. At 7, he walked the short distance to the cafe opposite the Prefecture, the same one where clerks went for their evening absinthe and policemen for coffee that tasted of metal. He chose a corner table facing the window and ordered a beer. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke and fatigue. A group of young detectives argued about a card game near the door, their laughter oddly sharp against the dullness of the rain. Maigret drank slowly, the taste settling on his tongue like a thought he didn't quite trust. Dubos. He had known him, of course. Years ago. An ambitious man with a fondness for shortcuts, eager to climb the ranks before his hair thinned. He had left Paris after a quarrel about a case, something small that had grown sour in the telling. Rumor had placed him Lyon, then Rouen. Perhaps he was still in the service. Perhaps not. He paid, left his glass half full, and went back to his office. The corridor was quiet now. Even the typewriters had gone to sleep. Only Janvier was there, leaning against the doorframe with a cigarette. He wasn't supposed to smoke indoors. "She's awake," Janvier said. "Asked for water. Didn't say much else." Maigret nodded. "Leave her for the night. No questions until morning." He sat down behind his desk. The lamp cast a circle of yellow light over the papers. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line, "Find Dubost." Then he dialed the number for the personnel records office, where a sleepy clerk answered after several rings. "Louis Dubost," Maigret said. "Inspector, formerly assigned to the 12th arrondissement. Where is he now?" The clerk rustled papers. "Transferred 2 years ago to Rouen, chief. Retired last winter." "An address?" The clerk hesitated, then read it out. A street on the outskirts of Rouen, a modest address, the kind given to men who had left the world behind without anyone noticing. Maigret wrote it down. He hung up and sat for a moment, staring at the name on the page. A retired inspector, an old case, a dead man who had whispered his innocence to the void. The threads were too fine to pull yet, but they were beginning to cross. He rose, went to the window, and looked out at the river. The mist had thickened again, swallowing the lamps. He thought of Claire Dufresne sleeping in the small room below, her face turned to the wall, and of Chabrier lying on a slab in the morgue, the sweet smell of veronal still clinging to him. Between them stretched 5 years of silence, and at the center of it, the name of a man who might have written a report too quickly. When morning came, Paris looked pale and new, as if the night rain had scrubbed it clean, but forgotten to dry it. Maigret arrived early, his coat still damp at the hem. He stopped by the detention rooms before going to his office. Claire was sitting on the narrow bed, awake, her hair unpinned, her expression unreadable. "I didn't sleep much," she said. "Few people do here," he replied gently. "Do you remember the name Dubost?" She frowned. "It sounds familiar. He might have mentioned it once. I thought it was someone from his old job." "He was a police inspector, the one who handled Chabrier's case." She looked at him, startled. "Then he was the one who ruined him?" "Possibly," Maigret said. "Or he was the one Chabrier blamed." Her hands tightened in her lap. He said they were watching him still, that there was someone who never forgave him for leaving quietly. I thought it was paranoia. Maybe it wasn't. He nodded slowly. I'm going to Rouen today. Her eyes flickered. To see this Dubos? Yes. And if he was the reason? Maigret shrugged, almost sadly. Then perhaps he won't wake up on his own either. He left her then, stopping only to tell Janvier to keep an eye on things in his absence. The train to Rouen left mid-morning, winding through a countryside still blurred with mist. Maigret sat by the window, his pipe between his teeth, unlit as usual. Outside, the fields passed in shades of green and grey, and every now and then a farmhouse appeared, smoke rising from the chimney like the ghost of something content. He thought of Dubost, as he must be now, a man who once carried the weight of the Republic in his coat pocket and then, one day, stopped carrying anything at all. It was strange how retirement softened the sharpest men. It was as if the world itself quietly erased their authority the moment they ceased to use it. Rouen was wet and narrow, the streets still shining from the morning rain. He found the address easily, a small building near the canal, its plaster cracked, a curtain half drawn on the ground floor. He knocked twice. The door opened a fraction, and an old voice said, "Yes? Louis Dubos?" There was a pause. "Who's asking?" "Maigret, from the Quai des Orfèvres." The door opened wider. The man standing there was smaller than he remembered. Thinner, the hair sparse and grey, the skin around his eyes like folded paper, but the mouth was the same, drawn tight in suspicion. "What could the Quai want with me after all this time?" Dubos asked. "Just a few questions. About a man named Chabrier." The old inspector's eyes flickered. He stepped aside. "Come in, then. I was wondering when that name would come back to haunt me." Maigret entered. The room smelled of tobacco and linseed oil, the scent of someone who lived alone but still cared about small order. On the mantelpiece were photographs, all turned face down. Dubos motioned him to sit. "Chabrier," he said again, almost to himself. "I remember. He didn't steal, if that's what you've come to prove. But it was easier to let the file say he did. Easier for everyone." Maigret watched him closely. "Easier for you too?" Dubos gave a thin smile. "You'll understand one day, Maigret. Sometimes truth costs more than a man's dignity, and I wasn't rich enough to pay." Outside, the canal's water lapped softly against the stones. Inside, Maigret's silence filled the room like a slow tide. The truth, he thought, had been sleeping for 5 years, and someone had whispered just loudly enough to wake it. Maigret studied Dubos quietly, his large frame settled into the chair with the stillness of someone waiting for a confession that might take all day. The old inspector's face was thin, the eyes a watery blue that held more memory than light. On the table between them stood a bottle of cognac and a single glass, half full, as if Dubost had been conversing with himself before Maigret arrived. "You said it was easier to let the file say he was guilty," Maigret said finally. "Easier for whom?" Dubost exhaled, not quite a sigh. "For the firm, for the department, for me." He was a clerk, a small man with smaller habits. When the accounts didn't balance, everyone looked to the quiet one. He didn't protest much, just stared at the papers like he'd never seen numbers before. He didn't steal. No, I knew it even then. The money was taken by a junior partner. I had proof, enough to make noise. But the partner's father was on the departmental council, and I was new in my post. They told me to close it. Chabrier's dismissal satisfied everyone. No trial, no scandal, just one man's silence. "Did you ever speak to him afterward?" Dubos poured himself the rest of the cognac, his hand trembling slightly. "Once. He came to see me a year later. He'd lost weight. Asked if the police ever corrected mistakes. I told him mistakes correct themselves if you wait long enough. He looked at me as if I'd said something cruel. Maybe I had." Maigret said nothing. He looked around the room. The tidy disorder of retirement, an open newspaper folded over an unfinished crossword, a small radio that hummed softly but with no station tuned. Did he mention anyone else? Maigret asked. A woman, perhaps. Dubos's eyes lifted, wary. He asked if I remembered a girl who used to bring coffee to the office, said she'd written to him once after he was dismissed. I didn't know her name then, but he called her Claire. Claire Dufresne, wasn't it? Maigret nodded slowly. She's in Paris. She says he sent her letters, that he believed someone was still watching him. Dubos gave a dry, humorless laugh. He wasn't wrong. Men like Chabrier never stop being watched, even when no one's looking. He carried his shame the way others carry their identity cards. There was a long pause. Maigret leaned back slightly, the chair creaking. You knew he hadn't taken the money and you left it that way. Do you feel responsible for what happened to him? Dubos turned the glass in his hand, watching the amber trace the rim. I've outlived many things I should have felt responsible for, Maigret. That one is only a pebble among stones. Maigret rose. If I asked for your statement, would you sign it? The old man's smile was faint. I would, but I doubt it would matter. What's another dead man's name cleared to anyone now? It might matter to the woman who whispered on the telephone, Maigret said. She thought she was helping him rest. Instead, she killed him. Dubos's hand paused halfway to the bottle. For the first time, his composure cracked, though only slightly. Killed him? She gave him the sedative, Veronal, meant to calm him, perhaps. But it stopped his heart. The silence that followed was deep enough to make the ticking of the small clock above the mantel sound like hammer blows. I suppose, Dubos said at last, that's how truth gets its revenge. Not through justice, but through accident. Maigret nodded. Truth is patient. Men aren't. He left soon after, stepping out into a narrow street washed clean by rain. The air smelled of wet stone and wood smoke. He walked slowly toward the station, his overcoat collar turned up against the chill. The conversation had not surprised him, not entirely. He had expected the confession without the remorse. It was the pattern of men who had once believed in rules, but learned to live by convenience. On the train back to Paris, he sat near the window, his hat on his knee. The countryside slipped by, blurred and grey. He thought of Claire Dufresne again. The way she had looked at him in the interrogation room, eyes heavy with something that was not quite guilt, not quite grief. She had loved Chabrier only as one loves a burden too familiar to put down. Now that burden was gone, and she was left with its weight all the same. By the time he reached the city, dusk had fallen. The lamps along the Seine burned weakly through the mist. At the Préfecture, Janvier was waiting by the door, his coat unbuttoned, hair damp. "Welcome back, Chief," he said. "We've had a visitor." "Who?" "A man from the ministry. Wanted to talk about the old Chabrier case. Said there was some confusion about the records." Maigret stopped. "What kind of confusion?" Janvier shrugged. "A few pages missing from the file. The report signed by Dubos wasn't the final one. There's mention of a supplementary statement. Someone else's handwriting, dated the same week." "Who signed it?" "No signature, just initials. CD." Maigret frowned. CD. Claire Dufresne. But she had been a secretary, not a witness, unless... He moved past Janvier and into his office. The file lay open on his desk, exactly where he'd left it. The top pages were as before, but beneath them, there it was, a thinner sheet, folded and nearly translucent with age. He smoothed it open. The writing was indeed in a woman's hand. The lines short, hesitant, almost ashamed. "I, Claire Dufresne, state that I saw Mr. Chabrier take the envelope from the drawer on the evening of the 12th. I do not know if he intended to steal it, but he placed it in his case. I was afraid to speak before." Maigret sat back slowly. The statement had been attached later after the case had already been closed. It bore no official seal. Perhaps Dubost had used it as justification, or perhaps someone had added it to make the file neat again, to give the illusion of completion. He looked out the window. The rain had started once more, fine and deliberate. He imagined Chabrier reading that letter years later, finding her signature there. CD, her handwriting, her betrayal. The proof he had shown her the night he died. He rubbed his temple with a heavy hand. The truth had been simpler than the lies surrounding it. She had once saved herself by condemning him. He had discovered it too late. The sedative she had given him might have been guilt in another form. When Janvier came in with fresh coffee, Maigret waved him away. "Leave it." He took his hat and coat again and went downstairs. In the small room near the holding cells, Claire Dufresne sat by the window, hands clasped tightly. She looked up when he entered. "You found him," she said quietly. "I did. He told me what happened 5 years ago." "And?" "He said you were the only person who ever believed him." She looked down, a faint tremor in her shoulders. "That's not true." "No," Maigret agreed softly. "It isn't." He laid the folded sheet of paper on the table between them. She didn't touch it, only stared. Her lips moved, but no words came. "He must have found it among the old files," Maigret said. "Maybe he wrote to the ministry asking for his record. They sent him a copy, and then he saw your name." Her face was pale now, her breath shallow. "I was 21. They told me if I didn't sign, I'd lose my position. It wasn't supposed to matter. They said he'd be let go quietly." "He believed you," Maigret said almost kindly. "And when he couldn't sleep, you tried to give him peace." She nodded once, a single tear running down her cheek. "He looked so tired, Inspector. I thought, if he could just rest." The silence that followed was heavy, but not cruel. Outside, the rain whispered against the glass. When he finally stood, she didn't look up again. He left her there, her head bowed, the truth spread out before her like something that could no longer be folded away. In his office, he took the pipe from his pocket but didn't light it. Through the window, Paris blurred under the steady drizzle. The city breathed its familiar sighs, and somewhere below, the river carried them all away. Maigret didn't return home that night. The rain had not stopped, only softened into a constant mist that clung to the window panes like smoke. The office felt suspended in that grey hour between exhaustion and decision, when even the clocks seemed to hesitate. He sat by the desk with the lamp low, its glow turning the papers amber, and reread the confession that was not a confession, the young woman's trembling words from 5 years ago. He could imagine her as she had been then. 21, frightened, perhaps summoned into a small office where men twice her age spoke in patient tones about responsibility and trust. He could see her signing the page quickly, the pen scratching like an insect on paper, thinking that a signature was only a formality, that no one would truly be harmed. It was an act born not of malice, but of weakness. Yet weakness has its victims too. He closed the file. His thoughts wandered to Madame Maigret. She would have left a light burning in the kitchen, her quiet signal that he could still come home to warmth. He almost smiled at the thought, but remained seated. The case had ended, or should have, but an ending built on silence is never finished. The woman downstairs was waiting for judgment, though the law had little appetite for punishing remorse. He took his coat and descended the stairs. The air in the corridor was heavy, the kind that held the odor of damp clothes and cold tobacco. Janvier was half asleep in the anteroom, a newspaper folded over his chest. He started up when Maigret passed. "You're still here, Chief?" Maigret nodded. "She's awake?" Janvier rubbed his eyes. "She hasn't closed them all night, just sits there." "Good. Let her." He paused, then added, "No formal charge yet." Janvier hesitated. "You mean to release her?" "I mean to understand her first." He walked on. The small room where Claire Dufresne waited had a single barred window. The rain outside blurred the light, so the shadows looked soft, almost kind. She was sitting as before, her hands clasped loosely now, her face pale but calm. She didn't look up when he entered. "I brought you some coffee," he said. She smiled faintly. "You think I deserve it? I think you need it." He placed the cup before her. The steam rose between them like a veil. "Do you have anyone?" he asked. "Family? Friends?" "No one close. My mother's gone. I live alone. I type letters for a law firm. They won't keep me now." "You're thinking ahead," he said quietly. "I've had all night to think." She looked at him finally. "Do you believe I meant to kill him?" "No," Maigret said. "But intention doesn't always matter. You tried to give him rest, but he'd already decided what rest he wanted." Her eyes glistened. "He forgave me once, long ago, when I couldn't face him. He said people like us weren't meant for grand gestures, only small mistakes." Maigret nodded. He wasn't wrong. He let her drink in silence. There was nothing theatrical about her grief. It was quiet, almost tender, like someone mourning not the man she lost, but the years between their wrong choices. "I'll have to send a report," Maigret said at last. "The magistrate will decide what happens next. You won't face prison, not for this, but you'll have to live with the rest." She gave a small nod, almost grateful. Living is punishment enough. He stayed a few minutes longer, then left her with the coffee and the sound of rain. Back upstairs, dawn was sliding into Paris, hesitant and colorless. The lamps along the Seine flickered out one by one, and the streets began to hum faintly with the first trams. Maigret watched through the window as a woman with an umbrella crossed the bridge alone. Her reflection wavered in the river, and for a moment he thought of Claire again, walking toward the station that night, her head bent under the rain. When he turned, Janvier was at the door again, looking awkward. "Chief, there's a call for you." "From Rouen." He took it at his desk. The voice on the line was low, uncertain. "Inspector Maigret, this is Dr. Fournier. You visited Louis Dubost yesterday, didn't you?" "Yes," Maigret said. "I'm afraid there's been an incident. The concierge found him early this morning. Gas heater left on, windows closed. It appears he took his own life." Maigret said nothing for a long moment. The rain outside had turned heavier, as though the city itself exhaled. "Thank you, Doctor," he said finally, and replaced the receiver gently. Janvier was watching him. "Something wrong?" "Dubost is dead." Janvier blinked. "Suicide?" "Most likely. Or remorse pretending to be suicide. It makes little difference." He moved to the window again. The mist had thickened so much that the river disappeared into it. "He told me truth costs more than dignity," Maigret murmured. "I suppose he finally paid." Janvier frowned. "You think it's connected?" "Everything is connected, even silence." For the rest of the morning he wrote his report. The words came slowly, each one deliberate. He described the facts without adornment. The phone call, the body, the confession, the rediscovered letter. But beneath the lines, he left the spaces that spoke for themselves, the spaces where understanding lived, where guilt and pity touched hands without either winning. When he finished, he looked at the clock. Nearly noon. He should have been hungry, but he wasn't. The office door creaked and Lucas came in with a fresh file, cheerful as always, until he saw the expression on Maigret's face. "Bad night?" he asked. "A long one," Maigret said. "What's that?" "Routine burglary case, Chief. Nothing special." "Good," Maigret said. "Let's keep it that way." Lucas nodded and left him alone again. The sound of footsteps faded. At last, Maigret put on his hat and coat. The rain had eased, turning the streets into a mirror of grey reflections. He walked without purpose, past the Préfecture, across the bridge, and into a small cafe that smelled of yeast and tobacco. The patron wiped the counter and nodded to him with mild familiarity. He ordered a beer and sat by the window. The glass was cool against his palm, the first swallow sharp and bitter. He watched people pass, clerks with newspapers tucked under their arms, mothers leading children by the hand. None of them knew that somewhere, in a small file marked closed, a man's life had been rewritten by the smallest of lies. He thought of Claire again, of the way she had looked at the paper with her own signature, unable to recognize the person who had written it, and of Dubos, who had buried truth beneath bureaucracy, believing that forgetting was a form of mercy. The city outside carried on, unbothered by such things. Paris was full of small tragedies that didn't make noise. That was what gave it its weight, its smell, its slow pulse. Maigret finished the beer, left a coin on the table, and rose. He walked toward the river, where the air was colder and the sound of water carried softly under the bridges. He stood there for a long while, hat low against the drizzle, pipe unlit. The river had always reminded him of time, never still, never clean, always taking with it what people wished would stay. He thought of a whisper, of a voice saying he won't wake up on his own. It was true of all of them, he supposed. Chabrier, Claire, Dubos. Perhaps even himself. He turned back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, slowly, the damp pavement gleaming underfoot, and as he walked, the city resumed its indifferent rhythm. The case was finished, though not ended. Some truths, Maigret knew, were not solved. They simply grew quieter. The river moved sluggishly, swollen from the rain, a dull grey ribbon twisting under the bridges. Maigret watched it for a while longer before turning away. The case should have ended there. A closed file, a suicide, a woman left behind with her quiet guilt. But something in him resisted finality. It wasn't restlessness. He had seen too many endings to mistake it for that. It was a small discomfort, the kind that hides in the details no one else bothers to notice. A whisper that would not stop repeating itself, he won't wake up on his own. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the building had resumed its weekday rhythm, typewriters clicking, footsteps echoing, the smell of coffee too bitter to be pleasant. Janvier was waiting by his office door again, holding a folded telegram. "This came an hour ago," he said, "from Rouen." Maigret took it, tore it open carefully. The message was short: autopsy completed, death by asphyxiation. Gas tap found open but not turned fully. Strangulation marks under collar line. Investigation suggests foul play. Fournier. He read it twice, then placed it on the desk without expression. Janvier watched him, uncertain. "So it wasn't suicide," Janvier said. "Not entirely," Maigret murmured. "Someone helped him die, or helped it look as if he had." Janvier frowned. But who would kill an old inspector with nothing left to hide? Maigret didn't answer immediately. He lit his pipe, drew on it once, then let the smoke curl upward in lazy spirals. Not someone avenging Chabrier, that's too late for revenge. More likely, someone afraid of what Dubost might have said. "Claire Dufresne?" Janvier asked carefully. Maigret shook his head. "No, she didn't know enough. She didn't even know he still lived in Rouen. Besides, remorse isn't a motive for murder. It's a prison of its own." He sat, folding his hands on the desk. "Find out who visited Dubost yesterday after I left. Speak to the concierge again, to the doctor, to anyone who brought him food or letters. Someone went there between dusk and midnight. Someone who thought the past could still be tidied up." Janvier nodded and left, quick and efficient as always. Maigret remained seated, his gaze drifting toward the rain-smeared window. The faint hum of the city pressed against the glass. He thought of Dubost's room. The lined face, the bottle of cognac, the photographs turned to the wall. Men like him never stopped believing in control, even when it cost them everything. Yet someone else had taken control at the end. By late afternoon, Janvier was back, shaking off his coat. "You were right, Chief," he said, dropping his notebook on the desk. "A visitor. A man, around 40, tall, grey coat. The concierge didn't catch his name, but she remembered the car. Black Citroën, government plates. Said he stayed no more than 20 minutes. "Government plates," Maigret repeated quietly. "Did he leave anything behind?" "A smell," Janvier said with a wry grin. "Tobacco, the strong English kind." Maigret didn't smile. "Find out which department issued those plates." Quietly. Janvier nodded again and went back into the corridor. Maigret stayed behind, staring at the telegram. The faintest unease stirred inside him. That same old feeling he had come to trust over the years, the one that started in the back of his mind and spread slowly until it shaped every thought. He went downstairs to the records room, where the older clerk looked up from his ledgers with a startled expression. "Chief Inspector? Do we have any record of communications between Dubost and the ministry?" Maigret asked. "Letters, pension requests, complaints, anything in the past 6 months." The clerk rummaged through a cabinet, his fingers leaving trails of dust on the folders. "Only this," he said, handing over a brown envelope. "Received 3 weeks ago, addressed to the Ministry of the Interior, returned unopened." The envelope was marked "Confidential." The handwriting was unmistakably Dubost's, neat but wavering, the script of a man whose control had become habit more than pride. Maigret slit it open carefully. Inside was a single page, folded twice. "To whom it may concern," it began, "I wish to correct the record regarding the case of Georges Chabrier, closed under my authority in 1939. New information has come to light. I am prepared to name the person who benefited from the falsified dismissal, should a formal inquiry be reopened." It was unsigned. Maigret folded the page again, his thumb pressing against the crease. The faint scent of tobacco clung to the paper, not the soft, domestic kind, but the heavy, imported blend Janvier had just mentioned. He slipped it into his coat pocket and went upstairs. When evening came, he walked home for the first time in 2 days. Madame Maigret was waiting as always, her face calm, her eyes searching his for something she couldn't name. "You haven't eaten properly," she said. "I'll manage," he replied. She poured soup into his bowl, then sat opposite him, hands folded. "It's not finished, is it?" He looked up. "What makes you think that?" She smiled faintly. "You haven't taken off your coat." He glanced down and almost laughed. "No," he said softly. "Not finished." She didn't press further. After the meal, she set a cup of coffee before him and touched his hand briefly. "Don't stay out too late," she said. "It's colder tonight." He left soon after. The city had quieted, the lamps casting pale halos on the wet cobblestones. He walked without hurry, the rhythm of his steps keeping pace with his thoughts. The ministry building stood dark except for one window on the second floor. A guard recognized him and let him through without question. Inside, he found the corridor deserted, the air thick with the stale scent of paper and polish. He climbed the stairs and stopped before a door marked Department of Internal Affairs. Restricted access. The light beneath it trembled slightly. He knocked once. A voice inside said, "Come in." The man at the desk looked up from a pile of files. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, with the careful confidence of someone accustomed to authority. A cigarette burned in the ashtray beside him. The air was thick with the same English tobacco. "Chief Inspector Maigret," the man said. "We met once at a briefing." Maigret nodded. "You handle departmental archives, don't you? Administrative reviews of former officers?" "Among other things. What can I do for you?" Maigret stepped closer, laying the brown envelope on the desk. This was found among the effects of a retired inspector, Louis Dubost. He was found dead yesterday. The cause was first reported as suicide. The autopsy suggests otherwise. The man's eyes flickered toward the envelope, then back to Maigret. And you brought it here because the letter was addressed to you. The man smiled thinly. Ah, I see. You're suggesting one of us assisted in his death? I'm suggesting, Maigret said slowly, that someone thought silence was safer than correction. The other man extinguished his cigarette, his movements too calm. The past, Chief Inspector, is a fragile thing. Sometimes it's best left undisturbed. Dubost understood that once. Maigret looked at him for a long moment, and yet someone disturbed it anyway. He turned to leave, but the man's voice stopped him. What do you intend to do with the woman? Claire Dufresne? She's not your concern. Everything connected to that file is our concern. Maigret paused at the door, his hand on the knob. You're mistaken, he said quietly. She's the only innocent one left. When he stepped outside, the night air hit him like a cleansing wind. The rain had stopped, and the city lights shimmered faintly on the wet streets. He didn't look back. Somewhere behind those windows, men were already rewriting what could not be changed. As he walked along the river, he thought again of the whisper on the telephone, of the phrase that had started it all. He won't wake up on his own. Perhaps it had never been about Chabrier. Perhaps it had been a warning about all of them, men who mistook silence for peace. The Seine moved quietly beneath him, carrying reflections that broke and reformed with each ripple. He stood there until the chill reached his bones, then turned toward home, the faint scent of English tobacco still clinging to his coat. The following morning came with a pale light that seemed reluctant to touch the city. The rain had stopped, but left a fine silvery residue over everything, the kind that made Paris look as though it were trapped behind glass. Maigret arrived early at the Quai des Orfèvres, his breath visible in the chill corridor, his mind turning over the words from the man at the ministry. The past is a fragile thing. He had heard variations of that phrase all his life, usually spoken by men who had something to lose if the past were ever properly examined. The office still smelled faintly of stale coffee and damp wool. Janvier was already there, bent over a typewriter with a cigarette hanging from his lips. He looked up as Maigret entered. "I've got the registration on that Citroën, Chief," he said. "Belongs to a departmental fleet, Ministry of the Interior, subsection for administrative oversight. The same unit Dubost's file was transferred to after his retirement." Maigret hung his hat, took off his coat, and sat. "And the visitor's name?" "Officially?" Janvier smiled thinly. "No record of any visit to Rouen yesterday, but the concierge insists she saw the man's face when he left. She picked him out from a photograph." Maigret looked up. "Whose photograph?" "Deputy Director Gérard Lemoine, Ministry of the Interior." The name rested in the air between them. Maigret remembered it from somewhere, buried in an old report, perhaps, or muttered in a corridor. A man with ambition wrapped in courtesy, one of those civil servants who could sign away a life without smudging his cufflinks. Janvier went on. "The local police questioned the neighbors this morning. Lemoine arrived around 9, stayed less than half an hour. No one saw him leave with anything, but the postman swears he heard raised voices just before the lights went out. By the time the concierge went up to check, the gas heater was hissing." Maigret filled his pipe without lighting it. "They'll say it was an accident," he murmured. "They already have," Janvier replied. He nodded absently. "They always do." He sat for a long time, motionless except for the slow rolling of the unlit pipe between his fingers. Outside, the river moved sluggishly under the bridge. There was no urgency in his manner, but his thoughts were working, quiet and precise. If Lemoine had gone to Rouen, it wasn't to pay respects. It was to erase something Dubos had written or promised to reveal. The letter Maigret had found was proof enough that Dubos had decided to speak, and the ministry tidy as always, had decided to make him silent again. By mid-morning, he was on the street, coat collar up, his hat pulled low against the damp wind. He walked the short distance to the ministry, not bothering to call ahead. The guards at the entrance recognized him and waved him through without enthusiasm. He moved slowly through the marble corridors that smelled faintly of polish and bureaucracy until he reached the familiar door marked with Lemoyne's name. The secretary, a young man with a neat parting and a wary expression, tried to stop him. "Monsieur Lemoyne is in conference," he began, but Maigret's glance was enough. The young man stepped aside. Lemoyne looked up from his desk when Maigret entered. He was immaculate as ever, the same cool assurance in his movements, though there was a stiffness now in the way he placed his pen down. "Chief Inspector," he said with the faintest smile. "You work early." "I slept late," Maigret replied. He remained standing. Dubost's death wasn't an accident. Lemoyne's expression didn't change, but his silence was almost theatrical. "Is that an accusation?" "Not yet, but it will be if you make me repeat myself." Lemoyne leaned back, his fingers steepled. "I understand your dedication to your work, Maigret. Truly, but you're meddling in matters beyond your rank. Dubost was a man who had outlived his usefulness. He couldn't leave old ghosts alone. He wanted a reckoning that would have hurt good people." "Good people," Maigret repeated softly. "Like you." Lemoyne's jaw tightened. "You're out of line." Maigret took the folded letter from his coat pocket and placed it on the desk. "He wrote this to you. It was returned unopened. Did you know he'd kept a copy?" The faintest flicker of surprise crossed Lemoyne's face. It was gone in an instant, but it was enough. Maigret saw it the same way he saw cracks form in glass, long before it shattered. "You're making dangerous assumptions," Lemoyne said evenly. "A retired inspector dies, and suddenly you see conspiracies. The ministry can't indulge that kind of imagination." Maigret picked up his hat. "I'm not asking for indulgence. Just time, and if something happens to that file, or to the woman who gave her statement 5 years ago, I'll make sure your name is on every page." He turned to leave. Behind him he heard the faint clatter of Lemoyne's lighter, the sound of a cigarette being lit with more force than needed. Outside, the sky was clearing slightly, the light thin but honest. Maigret stood on the steps for a long moment, breathing in the cold air. It was the smell of stone, water, and a kind of stubbornness that Paris never lost. He knew the conversation had changed nothing. Men like Lemoyne did not confess. They waited for things to pass. But he had planted something in him, a small disturbance that would grow quietly, like rust in metal. When he returned to the quay, the office was busier. Lucas had arrived, bringing with him the usual smell of rain and cigars. "You heard about Rouen?" he asked. "Word's traveling fast. Papers are calling it a tragic accident." "They always prefer tragedy to guilt," Maigret said, hanging his hat. "Anything you want me to do?" Lucas asked. Maigret nodded. "Have someone watch Lemoyne?" "Nothing official. Just eyes. He's too composed for an innocent man." Lucas grinned. "Understood." When he was alone again, Maigret went to the window. Across the courtyard, the rain had stopped, and sunlight was filtering through the thinning clouds. It made the puddles shimmer like dull mirrors. He thought of Claire Dufresne, still in custody but soon to be released. She would walk out into this same light, probably with nowhere to go. Her life would resume, changed in ways no court could measure. Dubost was gone, but his death had not closed the circle. It had widened it. Maigret lit his pipe at last. The smoke curled upward, soft and grey. In it, he could almost see them all. Chabrier with his quiet dignity, Claire with her trembling signature, Dubost with his cowardly half-truths, and now Lemoyne, clean, careful, certain he'd done the right thing. The pattern was familiar, It was the geometry of power and guilt, one line feeding the next until the whole design became invisible. He exhaled slowly and watched the smoke fade. By evening, a telegram arrived from Rouen. It was short and unsigned. The man you met yesterday is not the man who signed Dubost's final report. Be careful whom you trust. Maigret read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Outside, the river moved again, steady, indifferent. He rose, took his coat and hat, and stepped into the corridor, his footsteps echoing softly against the walls. The city was waiting, quiet but listening. And somewhere, beneath all that silence, something still breathed. The telegram lay on his desk like a riddle that refused to reveal its face. The paper was thin, the type faint, but its weight seemed greater than anything else in the room. Be careful whom you trust. He had received warnings before, veiled ones, whispered ones. But this was different. It came not as a threat, but as a quiet, urgent kindness, and that made it more dangerous. Maigret turned it over in his fingers. There was no signature, no sender's mark, only the faint scent of machine oil, as if it had passed through too many hands before reaching him. He thought of the words again. The man you met yesterday is not the man who signed Dubost's final report. The meaning unfolded slowly, like smoke rising through cold air. He went to the filing cabinet, pulled out the Chabrier dossier, and laid it open. The last pages, the official closure documents, the attached witness statement, the terse signature of L. Dubost, all bore the same steady, angular handwriting he had seen in the earlier reports. But now, under the lamplight, something stirred in his memory. The signature in the earlier letters from Dubost had been slightly different, less rigid, the loops broader. The one on the final report was tighter, neater, almost mechanical. He compared them side by side, not a forgery by an amateur hand. Too skilled for that, but not the same man's either. The kind of imitation that comes from proximity, a colleague, perhaps a subordinate. Someone who knew the gesture, but not the rhythm of it. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest. That slow, quiet satisfaction that came when the shape of deceit began to emerge. He was still studying the signatures when Janvier returned, a fresh folder tucked under his arm. "Chief, something strange about Lemoine's record," he said. "There's a missing year in his file. Between 1939 and 1940. No assignment listed, no leave noted, nothing. After that, he's transferred into administrative oversight, where he's stayed ever since." Maigret didn't look up. 1939, he murmured. The year Chabrier was dismissed. Janvier nodded. Exactly. And another thing, the file clerk swears that when the Chabrier case was first archived, it wasn't Dubost who signed the final page. It was Lemoine, the same man who now calls himself deputy director. Maigret sat back in his chair, his eyes on the smoke curling from his pipe. "So Lemoine buried a case he helped create," he said quietly. "He wasn't a bureaucrat back then. He was still in uniform, a junior inspector, working under Dubost." Janvier hesitated. "You think he forged the report?" "I think he finished it for him," Maigret said, and then made sure no one ever asked why. He rose, moving slowly to the window. Outside, the Seine gleamed like tarnished metal, the evening light thin and restless. "The past," he said, half to himself, "is never fragile. It's the men who try to protect it who are." Janvier said nothing. He knew better than to disturb that tone in Maigret's voice, the one that came when thought began turning into instinct. "Have Lucas bring Claire Dufresne to my office," Maigret said at last. "She's to be released anyway, but I want a word before she goes." When she entered 20 minutes later, her coat buttoned to the throat, she looked smaller, more composed. The sleeplessness had softened into a kind of weary calm. Maigret gestured to the chair across from him. "They'll let you go today," he said. "There's no case for the magistrate." "I didn't expect there would be," she said quietly. "You told me once that Chabrier said people were still watching him, that he felt haunted by someone he couldn't name." She nodded. "Did he ever mention another policeman, a man called Lemoyne?" She frowned, thinking. Maybe. "He said there was one man who'd spoken for him at first, who'd promised to help, but later he said that man was worse than the rest, that he'd turned everything upside down." "Did he describe him?" "Only that he had kind eyes," she said with a trace of irony. "The kind that make you believe what you shouldn't." Maigret leaned forward slightly. "If I showed you a photograph, would you recognize him?" She hesitated. "Perhaps." He opened a drawer, took out the file Janvier had assembled, and handed her the portrait of Gérard Lemoine, younger then, his hair darker, the face untroubled. She stared at it a long moment, then nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "That's him." Maigret took the photograph back, slipping it into the folder. "You've been carrying a burden that wasn't yours, mademoiselle. The lie that condemned him began before you ever signed that paper." Her voice trembled. "And now it's too late to tell him." He didn't answer. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window pane and the light flickered over her face. He saw, not for the first time, how ordinary tragedy looked when stripped of its drama. Just two people in a grey room, both tired, both trying to find a shape for something that had no name. When she left, he remained seated, staring at the door long after it had closed. Then he reached for the telephone and dialed a number from memory. "This is Maigret," he said. "Put me through to Rouen. Prefect Fournier." There was a pause, a crackle of static. Then a voice came through, warm but wary. "Maigret, I thought you might call." "The telegram you sent," Maigret said. "Who wrote it?" There was silence on the line. "I can't say over the phone," Fournier said finally. "But it wasn't one of my men. The message arrived already sealed. No return address. We thought it best to forward it." "Did it come from Rouen?" "No," the prefect said. "Postmarked from Paris." Maigret thanked him and hung up. The room felt colder now, though the radiator hissed quietly. Someone in Paris wanted him to know what he had already begun to suspect. Someone close enough to the ministry to see what others couldn't, but frightened enough to hide behind anonymity. He lit his pipe again, the flame trembling in the draught. The case had begun with a whisper, and now it was ending the same way. Half-truths and warnings in the dark. But beneath them, the outline was clear. Lemoine had silenced Dubos, perhaps not with his own hands, but with his orders. And someone inside his own office wanted it known. He left just after dusk, the folder tucked under his arm. The ministry building loomed across the square, its windows glowing faintly. He didn't expect to find Lemoine there. Men like that preferred to act from a distance. But he wanted to walk past it, to let the city itself remind him that nothing was truly hidden. As he passed the entrance, a man stood under the archway smoking. His coat was too fine for the cold, his shoes too clean for the wet pavement. He raised his eyes briefly, and Maigret recognized him, the young secretary who had tried to keep him out the day before. Their gazes met for an instant, long enough for the boy to drop his cigarette and step back into the shadows. Maigret didn't follow. He knew the look, guilt mixed with fear, the kind that ripened in silence until it became unbearable. The boy would talk, sooner or later. They always did. He turned back toward the river, his coat heavy with damp, his thoughts steady. Behind him, the city swallowed the ministry's light. Ahead, the Seine lay calm, dark, and infinite. The water carried reflections that blurred and reformed. Windows, bridges, the faint glow of life continuing, and Maigret, watching it, understood what Chabrier had meant when he spoke of ghosts that never stopped watching. It wasn't the dead who haunted the living. It was the truth that refused to sink. Maigret didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window of his apartment, the lights of the boulevard Richard Lenoir reflected faintly in his glass of beer. The city was quieting itself. The last trams rattled by. The pavement washed pale under the street lamps. Madame Maigret had long gone to bed, trusting that whatever kept him awake was something that had to run its course. She had learned, over the years, that silence was part of his work. Not the silence of thought, but the silence that waited for truth to arrive on its own. The pattern of the case had become clear now, like a photograph slowly emerging in the developer's tray. He thought of the small clerk who had been buried by lies, the woman who had tried to mend the unfixable, the inspector who had chosen convenience over courage, and the official who had believed himself above consequence. They were all bound together, each trying to cover a corner of the same old stain. The knock came a little before midnight. It was soft but deliberate. Maigret opened the door to find Janvier standing there, his hat dripping, his expression uneasy. "He's here, Chief," he said. "The secretary from the ministry. He asked to see you. Said he couldn't wait until morning." "Bring him in." The young man entered, pale beneath the rain's chill, his eyes darting toward the corners of the room as if afraid of being seen even here. Maigret motioned him to sit. "I didn't know who else to talk to," the secretary began. "I saw you yesterday, and I thought you might understand. It's about Monsieur Lemoine." "Go on," Maigret said quietly. The boy swallowed. He wasn't supposed to go to Rouen himself. He sent another man first, someone from internal oversight, to collect a file from Dubost's apartment. But when the man came back empty-handed, Lemoine panicked. He went himself that evening. I heard him say he'd finish what should have been finished years ago. Did he tell you what he meant? The boy shook his head. He didn't have to. I saw the letter. Dubost's letter, the one you found. He had made a copy. It named Lemoine as the officer who falsified the dismissal report. If it had reached the ministry, he'd have been ruined. So he went to Rouen to silence him, Maigret said. Yes, and when he came back, he burned the copy in his office. I was the one who posted the telegram to you. The boy's voice trembled. I thought someone had to know. He said it was an accident, that the old man had turned on the gas himself. But he looked different after that. Smaller, somehow. He hasn't been in since. Maigret studied him. The young man's hands were shaking. He was not built for guilt. You did the right thing, Maigret said simply. Go home now. Don't speak of this to anyone. There'll be questions soon enough. When the door closed behind him, Maigret stood for a moment, listening to the muffled hum of the city beyond the walls. Then he took his hat and coat again. The ministry's courtyard was deserted when he arrived. Only a single light burned behind a frosted window on the second floor. Lemoine's office. The guard at the gate hesitated, but the weight of Maigret's name was still enough. Inside, he climbed the stairs without hurry. The door to the office stood ajar. The room was filled with smoke, not from fire, but from the cigarette that still burned in the ashtray beside an untouched glass of water. Lemoine sat behind the desk, his posture composed, his face pale and slick with sweat. So you found your way back, he said quietly, without surprise. I always do, Maigret replied. For a while, neither spoke. The air smelled of paper, tobacco, and something faintly medicinal. You've talked to the boy, Lemoine said finally. Yes. And you think I killed Dubost? I don't think, Maigret said. I know. The gas tap wasn't turned far enough for accident. You were the last man there. You silenced him to protect a lie you helped create. It doesn't matter whether you meant to kill him or only frighten him. He's dead, and the truth is awake now. Lemoine gave a short, tired laugh. The truth, he said. You think that word still has meaning here. The ministry won't prosecute me. They'll transfer me, write a report, bury another file. You know that as well as I do. Yes, Maigret said. But it will be written down this time. Properly. Not in a file, but in memory. You'll find that harder to erase. Lemoine stood, the movement slow and deliberate. You're a good man, Maigret, but good men grow old faster than the rest of us. He reached for his hat, hesitated, then dropped it back onto the desk. I suppose I should thank you. You've given me an ending that suits the story. Maigret watched him leave, his footsteps fading down the corridor. He didn't follow. Some confessions didn't need witnesses. They only needed air to breathe. When dawn came, the newspaper spoke of a senior official found dead in his car near the Seine, the engine running, the cause undetermined. Maigret didn't read past the headline. He had already imagined the scene before the reporters had arrived. The stillness, the faint smell of exhaust, the man sitting upright with his hat in his lap. At the Quai des Orfèvres, life resumed its ordinary rhythm. Files were stamped, telephones rang, and the river outside carried its calm deceit downstream. Janvier came to the office doorway and hesitated. "It's over, then?" he asked. Maigret nodded. "As over as these things ever are." "And the woman?" "She's gone. Left the city early this morning. I told them to let her be." Janvier looked as if he wanted to ask more, but thought better of it. "Coffee?" he offered. "Later," Maigret said. When the door closed, he turned to the window. The rain had returned, fine as breath, tracing the same paths down the glass it always did. Somewhere below, the river murmured its endless story, one of the few things in Paris that never lied. He tamped the pipe, lit it, and leaned back, letting the smoke blur the view outside. A man had died for a lie, a woman had killed for love, and an old inspector had paid for his cowardice. And Maigret, once again, had done nothing heroic, only waited long enough for human nature to reveal itself. He took a slow draw and exhaled, the smoke curling upward like the last trace of a whisper. In the quiet, he could almost hear her voice again, the one that had started it all. He won't wake up on his own. Perhaps none of them ever had. He set the pipe down and watched the rain darken the city until the streets and river were one. Then, with the patience of a man who understood the weight of endings, he closed the Chabrier file and slid it gently into the drawer, where it joined the others. Silent, complete, and at last, at rest.